Elizabeth Ashford stood alone in the middle of the great hall, watching two strange men carry her mother's piano out through the front doors. They did not ask her permission. They did not even look at her. Why would they? Nothing in this house belonged to her anymore. Not the piano, not the paintings, not the silver candlesticks her grandmother had left her, not even the roof over her head. 6 weeks ago, her husband Charles had vanished in the night, leaving behind a mountain of debts and a wife who knew nothing about any of it. 3 days ago, his coat and hat had been found washed up on the rocky shore near Dover. The magistrate had said the words gently, as if gentleness could soften them. "I am sorry, Mrs. Ashford. Your husband is presumed drowned. You are a widow now." A widow, a penniless widow, 26 years old, with nowhere to go and no one willing to take her in. Elizabeth had one small trunk packed by the door. In 1 hour, the house would no longer be hers to stand in. She had no idea where she would sleep that night. And that was the moment she heard the carriage. It came up the long drive, pulled by 4 black horses, and it was grander than anything she had ever seen. The creditor's men stopped their work to stare. Even the piano was set down on the gravel, forgotten. A footman opened the carriage door, and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a dark gray coat, and he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had never once been told no asterisk. He walked up the front steps, past the furniture scattered across the drive, past the gawking workmen, and stopped directly in front of Elizabeth. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "my name is Ravenmore. I am the man who bought this estate." The Duke of Ravenmore. Elizabeth had heard the name whispered, one of the richest men in England and one of the most mysterious. And now he owned her home, her whole world, sold to a stranger. She lifted her chin, determined not to cry in front of him. "Then I will not trouble you further, Your Grace. I was just leaving." She reached for her trunk, but his next words stopped her cold. "You may stay, madam." He paused, and his dark eyes held hers. "But I have one condition." Then, without explaining another word, the Duke of Ravenmore walked past her, into her asterisk house, and left Elizabeth standing on the steps with her heart pounding. One condition. What could a man who owned half the country possibly want from a woman who had nothing left at all? To understand how Elizabeth Ashford came to be standing alone on those steps, we must go back to the beginning, back to when she still believed her husband was an honest man. Elizabeth had married Charles Ashford 5 years earlier. He was handsome, charming, and he laughed easily, and at 19, Elizabeth had mistaken charm for character. Her father, a respectable country gentleman, had given her a generous dowry and his blessing. The wedding had been beautiful. The whole county had attended. For a while, life had seemed golden. But small cracks had appeared, one by one. Letters that Charles burned in the fireplace before she could see them. Trips to London that lasted longer and longer. Men who came to the door asking for him, men with hard eyes who did not leave their names. "Business matters, my darling," Charles would say, kissing her forehead. "Nothing for you to worry your pretty head about." She had believed him. God forgive her, she had believed him for years. Then, on a cold night in March, Elizabeth woke to find the other side of the bed empty. She found a single note on his desk, written in a hurried hand. "Forgive me, it is better this way. See asterisk." That was all, 10 words after 5 years of marriage. By morning, the truth came crashing down on her like a wave. Charles owed money everywhere. Gambling debts, failed investments, loans taken against the house, against the land, against her own dowry, all of it signed away in secret, all of it gone. The solicitor who explained it to her had to say the final number twice, because Elizabeth simply could not believe it the first time. "But that is impossible," she had whispered. "We would have had to be ruined for years." "You were, madam," the solicitor said quietly. "You simply did not know it." What followed were the cruelest weeks of Elizabeth's life, and the cruelty did not come from strangers. It came from her friends. Lady Whitmore, who had dined at Elizabeth's table 100 times, now looked straight through her at church as if she were made of glass. Invitations stopped arriving. When Elizabeth walked through the village, conversations hushed, and she could feel the whispers crawling on her back like insects. The Ashford woman, her husband ran from his debts. They say he had a mistress in London. They say she must have known. She had not known, but no one cared about that. The deepest cut came from her own sister, Margaret. Elizabeth had written to her, asking, begging for a room, just until she could find her footing. Margaret's reply arrived 4 days later, and Elizabeth would remember its coldness for the rest of her life. Dearest Elizabeth, you must understand my position. Henry's career cannot survive a scandal, and your presence in our home would invite exactly that. Surely you see that it would be selfish of you to ask. I will pray for you. Selfish? Her own sister had called her selfish for asking not to sleep in the street. Then came the news from Dover. A fisherman had found a gentleman's coat tangled in the rocks and a hat nearby. Inside the coat pocket, Charles Ashford's calling cards, ruined by seawater. The magistrate concluded that Charles, hunted by his creditors and drowning in shame, had thrown himself into the sea. Elizabeth wept that night, though even as she wept, she could not have said whether it was grief or anger or something darker than both. The man had destroyed her twice, once by his lies and once by his death, which sealed her fate as a ruined widow forever. The estate was seized and put up for sale, and it sold shockingly fast within days to a buyer no one had met, for a price no one dared repeat aloud. Which brings us back to that gray afternoon, to the piano on the gravel drive, to the black carriage, and to the tall stranger who now stood in Elizabeth's drawing room as if he had stood there all his life. Elizabeth followed him inside, her hands clenched to stop them trembling. Whatever his asterisk condition was, she told herself she would refuse it. She was poor, but she was not for sale. She had heard stories of rich men and desperate widows, and she would rather sleep in a hedgerow than become one of those stories. The Duke stood by the tall windows, looking out over the gardens. Strange, she thought, he did not look around the room the way a new owner would, curious and appraising. He looked, as if he were remembering something. "Your Grace," Elizabeth said, keeping her voice steady, "you spoke of a condition. I should tell you plainly that there are conditions I will never accept, no matter how poor I am." The Duke turned. For a moment, something flickered across his face. She could not tell if it was amusement or respect. "You misunderstand me, Mrs. Ashford," he said. "I am not in the habit of purchasing people, only houses." "Then what do you want from me?" He was silent for a long moment. Outside, she could hear the workmen carrying the piano back up the steps, back into the house, on the Duke's orders, though she had not heard him give any. "My condition is simple," the Duke said at last. "You will remain in this house as its keeper. You will have your own rooms, a proper allowance, and the respect of every servant under this roof. In return, I ask only one thing." Elizabeth waited, her heart hammering. "Every evening at 7 o'clock you will dine with me, at that table." He nodded toward the dining room doors. "Nothing more, nothing less. One dinner every evening that I am in residence." Elizabeth stared at him. Of all the things she had imagined, this was not one of them. "Dinner," she repeated. "That is all, that is your price." "That is my price." "But why?" The Duke of Ravenmore picked up his gloves from the table and walked toward the door. He paused beside her, just for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only she could hear it. "You will have questions, Mrs. Ashford. I advise you not to ask them." Then he was gone, his carriage rolling down the drive, leaving Elizabeth alone in the great hall, a widow with a roof over her head once more, a stranger's servants unpacking a stranger's belongings around her, and a single question burning in her mind like a candle that would not go out. What kind of man buys an entire estate and asks only for dinner? She would learn the answer soon enough, and when she did, it would break her heart before it healed it. The first dinner was the longest hour of Elizabeth's life. She had spent the entire afternoon convincing herself not to go. She was not a servant to be summoned. She was not an entertainer hired to fill a rich man's silence. 3 separate times, she decided she would send word that she was unwell. And 3 separate times, she remembered the truth. She had nowhere else in the world to go. So at 7 o'clock exactly, Elizabeth Ashford walked into her own dining room as a guest, wearing her best remaining dress, the gray silk, 3 years out of fashion, and found the Duke of Ravenmore already standing at the head of the table. "Mrs. Ashford," he gave a small bow, "thank you for your punctuality." "You did not leave me much choice, Your Grace." "No," he agreed without a trace of shame, "I did not." He held out her chair himself, not the chair at the far end of the long table where she had expected to sit, but the one directly at his right hand. Elizabeth sat down stiffly, her back straight as a fence post, and prepared herself for whatever this strange arrangement truly was. But nothing happened. The soup was served, the Duke ate quietly, the fish was served. The Duke made one remark about the weather turning cold early this year. The roast was served. Silence. Elizabeth had braced herself for improper suggestions, for prying questions, for cruelty dressed up as charity. Instead, she found herself sitting beside a man who seemed perfectly content to say almost nothing at all, and who, strangest of all, seemed to be savoring the meal as though it were some rare occasion, as though a simple Tuesday dinner of soup and roast lamb were a feast he had waited years to taste. At one point she caught him looking not at her and not at his plate but slowly around the room itself, at the high ceiling, at the long windows, at the great stone fireplace with the Ashford crest carved above it. There was an expression on his face she could not name. It was not the pride of a new owner admiring his purchase. It looked, she thought, almost like grief. "The house pleases you, Your Grace?" she asked before she could stop herself. His eyes came back to her at once, and the strange expression vanished behind that calm, unreadable mask. "It is a fine house," he said simply. "Most new owners wish to change things. New furniture, new colors. You have changed nothing. You even had my mother's piano carried back inside. Should I have left it in the rain?" "That is not an answer." "No," the Duke said, and there was the faintest ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "It is not." When the clock struck 8, he rose, bowed, and wished her a good night. That was all. Elizabeth returned to her rooms more confused than she had been that morning, and though she would not admit it to herself, more curious. The days settled into a strange rhythm. By daylight, Elizabeth hardly saw him. The Duke rode out early, met with land agents and tenants, answered letters that arrived by the dozen from London. She meanwhile discovered that her position as keeper of the house was no empty title. The servants, his servants, treated her with careful respect and came to her with every household question, as though the Duke had given them firm instructions on the matter. He had given them one other instruction, too. Elizabeth overheard it by accident when the new housekeeper spoke to a young maid in the corridor. "His Grace's orders are plain. Anyone who speaks one unkind word about Madam's late husband or her misfortunes will be dismissed the same day. Now mind your tongue." Elizabeth stood frozen behind the corner, her hand pressed to her chest. When was the last time anyone had protected her name? She could not remember. But if the Duke was kind within his walls, the world outside them was another matter. The village had a new story now, and it was uglier than the old one. Elizabeth felt it the first Sunday she attended church. The whispers no longer said poor ruined Mrs. Ashford *. They said something far worse. She heard it plainly at last from Lady Whitmore herself, who made sure to say it just loudly enough to her companion as Elizabeth passed by the churchyard gate. Living in his house, dining at his table, and her husband barely cold in the sea. Well, we need not wonder what * price the widow paid. There is an old word for women like that, my dear, and it is not housekeeper." The other woman laughed behind her glove. Elizabeth walked on with her head high and her face burning. She did not cry until she was home, behind her own locked door where no one could see. It was so bitterly unfair. She had done nothing, and yet the whole county had already tried her and found her guilty. That evening she came to dinner pale and silent. The Duke noticed at once. He said nothing for the first 2 courses, and then, without looking up from his plate, "Lady Whitmore's husband owes £3,000 to a bank in London, a bank which, as of last month, belongs to me." He cut his meat calmly. "One word from you, Mrs. Ashford, and the lady will be selling her piano by Christmas." Elizabeth's fork stopped in the air. "You heard what she said." "I hear most things." She stared at him, this cold, mysterious man, offering to ruin a countess over an insult at a churchyard gate. And the most frightening part was that she could see he meant it. "No," Elizabeth said at last quietly. "I know what it is to lose everything, your grace. I would not wish it on my worst enemy." The Duke looked up then, and for a long moment he studied her face, as though she had said something remarkable, something he had not expected. "No," he said slowly, "you truly wouldn't, would you?" It was not a question, and there was something in his voice, a kind of wonder almost, that Elizabeth did not understand. It was late October when the small strange things began to add up. The first was the door. A young footman new to the house could not find the silver closet, and the Duke, passing through the corridor, said without thinking, "Third door past the china room, behind the green curtain." The green curtain had hung there for 30 years. Elizabeth knew because her mother-in-law had chosen it. How did a man who had owned the house for 6 weeks know what was behind it? The second was the garden. From her window one misty morning, Elizabeth watched the Duke walk the grounds alone, and he did not wander like a man learning his new property. He walked straight to the old well behind the kitchen garden, the one hidden entirely by hedges, the one even delivery men could never find. He stood beside it for a long time, his head bowed, his hand resting on the stone rim, as if he were visiting a grave. And the third thing, the thing that kept Elizabeth awake that night, happened at dinner on the last evening of the month. The cook, wishing to impress, had prepared an elaborate French dish. The Duke ate politely but without interest. Then, almost to himself, so quietly that Elizabeth barely caught the words, he said, "The kitchen here used to make a plain bread pudding, with apples from the orchard." A pause. "That was the finest thing ever to come out of it." Elizabeth set down her glass. "Used to, your grace," she said softly. "The kitchen used to make it." The silence that followed was sharp as broken glass. The Duke's jaw tightened. He had made a mistake, and they both knew it. "A figure of speech," he said, rising from the table, though the clock had not yet struck 8. "Good night, Mrs. Ashford." "You have been in this house before," Elizabeth said to his back. Her heart was pounding, but she could not stop herself. "You knew it long before you bought it. When, your grace, when were you here before?" The Duke of Ravenmore stopped in the doorway. He did not turn around. "I warned you once about questions, madam," he said quietly. "That warning stands." Then he was gone, and Elizabeth sat alone at the long table, her thoughts racing in the candlelight. He knew this house. He knew its curtains and its hidden well and the taste of its bread pudding. This was no stranger who had bought a ruined estate for a bargain price. The Duke of Ravenmore had come home. But that was impossible. Elizabeth knew every family who had ever been connected to this place. She had heard all the old stories from her mother-in-law 100 times. There had never been any Duke. There had never been any Ravenmore. So who was he? And what in heaven's name had this house done to him? November came, and with it the long, dark evenings. And somewhere in those dark evenings, without either of them quite noticing, the dinners began to change. It started with small things. The Duke asked her opinion on a tenant dispute, and then actually listened to her answer. Elizabeth mentioned that the North Field had flooded every winter for as long as she could remember, and 2 days later, she saw men digging a new drainage ditch exactly where she had said the water gathered. "You took my advice," she said at dinner that evening, unable to hide her surprise. "You were right," the Duke said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Why would I not?" Elizabeth did not know how to tell him that in 5 years of marriage, Charles had never once asked her opinion on anything more important than the color of his waistcoat. Slowly, carefully, like two people crossing a frozen pond, they began to talk. Never about the past, his warning still hung between them like a locked door, but about the estate, about books, about the small daily happenings of the house. Elizabeth discovered that beneath all that granite silence, the Duke had a dry, quiet wit that caught her off guard. The first time he made her laugh, truly laugh, out loud, they both froze in surprise at the sound of it. Elizabeth could not remember the last time she had laughed. Somewhere in the wreckage of the past year, she had simply forgotten how. "Forgive me," she said, embarrassed, reaching for her napkin. "For what?" the Duke asked quietly. "I don't know," laughing. "It feels wrong somehow, after everything." The Duke was silent for a moment. Then he said, in a voice softer than she had ever heard from him, "My mother used to say that laughter in a hard life is not a sin, Mrs. Ashford. It is a victory." It was the first time he had ever mentioned his mother. Elizabeth held very still, the way one holds still near a wild bird, hoping it will come closer. "She sounds like a wise woman, is she?" "Good night, Mrs. Ashford." The bird flew. The Duke rose, bowed, and was gone before the clock struck 8. But that night, Elizabeth noticed he had left his glass of port untouched, and that his hand, when he lifted it to bow, had not been entirely steady. It was a Tuesday in mid-November when Elizabeth could not sleep. The wind was rattling the shutters, and her mind was rattling too, full of questions with no answers. Near midnight, she gave up, lit a candle, and went down to the library to find something dull enough to make her drowsy. She was 3 steps into the room before she realized she was not alone. The Duke stood at the far wall where the old family portraits hung, the long row of Ashfords going back 4 generations. He had not heard her come in. He was in his shirt sleeves, his coat thrown over a chair, and he held a candle up before one portrait in particular. Elizabeth knew that portrait well. It was her late mother-in-law, Charles's mother, the old Lady Ashford, painted some 30 years ago as a young woman in a blue dress, seated in the garden with the house behind her. The Duke was staring at it with an expression that stopped Elizabeth's breath. Gone was the granite mask. His face in the candlelight was open, raw, and terribly young, and it was filled with a hatred so deep and a sorrow so deep that the two could not be told apart. In his other hand he held something. A letter, old, yellowed, soft at the creases as though it had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times. He raised his eyes from the letter to the portrait, and Elizabeth heard him speak, a low murmur, meant for no living soul. "You knew, God forgive you, you knew, and you shut the door anyway." Elizabeth's candle flickered in the draught. The Duke turned. In a heartbeat, the letter vanished into his pocket and the mask came down over his face, but not fast enough. Not this time. She had seen behind it and they both knew it. "Mrs. Ashford," his voice was cold and even, "it is midnight." I could not sleep. Her heart was hammering, but she stood her ground. "Your Grace, that portrait, Lady Ashford, did you know her?" "I never had that honor," he said, each word precise as a chess move. "Then why?" "You are cold, madam, and the hour is late." He picked up his coat. "Take whatever book you came for." He walked past her toward the door, and perhaps it was the lateness of the hour, or the wind, or the memory of his voice saying laughter is a victory, but Elizabeth did something she had never dared before. She spoke to the Duke of Ravenmore as if he were simply a man. "Whatever this house did to you," she said quietly to his back, Whatever asterisk they did to you, I am sorry for it, even without knowing what it was. I know what it feels like when a door is shut in your face by people who should have opened it. My own sister shut hers, so did every friend I ever had. Her voice trembled, but she finished. You gave me a roof when the whole world turned away, Your Grace. If you ever wish to put down whatever it is you are carrying, my door is open. That is all. The silence that followed lasted so long that she thought he might simply walk out without a word. Instead, the Duke spoke without turning, his hand on the door frame, his voice so low she barely heard it over the wind. You should not waste your kindness on me, Mrs. Ashford, when you learn why I bought this house. He paused, and something in that pause frightened her more than any words. You may not forgive me for it. The door closed softly behind him. Elizabeth stood alone in the dark library, her candle shaking in her hand, staring at the portrait of the young Lady Ashford in her blue dress, smiling out of the frame, with all her secrets painted safely behind her eyes. You knew, and you shut the door anyway. Knew what? She found the first piece of the answer 4 days later, in the last place she expected, the sewing basket of the oldest servant in the parish. Old Martha had been a laundry maid at the house half a century ago, and now lived with her granddaughter in a cottage by the mill. Elizabeth had taken to visiting her on Thursdays, bringing bread and tea from the great house, one of the small duties she had invented for herself, and one of the few things that made her feel useful. That Thursday, as Martha's needle worked and the fire crackled, Elizabeth mentioned, carefully, casually, that the new master seemed to know the house uncommonly well. The old woman's needle stopped. Martha said slowly. They say he's a duke from up north, Ravenmore. She was quiet a moment. It's a strange thing, madam, that name. Strange how? There was a girl worked at the great house, long before your time. Before the young master was born, even. Prettiest creature you ever saw, and good as bread she was. A housemaid. Martha's eyes had gone far away, 50 years away. One winter she was just gone, turned out. No character, no wages, nothing. In the snow, madam, and her in the condition she was in. Elizabeth's mouth went dry. The condition. With child, madam. Martha's needle began to move again, fierce and quick. And no one ever said whose child it was, but no one ever needed to say it neither, not to them that had eyes. The fire popped. Outside, the mill wheel turned and turned. Martha, Elizabeth said, and her own voice sounded far away to her. The girl, the housemaid, what was her name? The old woman looked up from her sewing, and her eyes were wet and sharp all at once. Mary, she said. Mary Raven asterisk, madam. Raven like the bird. Raven. Raven asterisk more. Elizabeth sat very still in the small, warm cottage, while everything she thought she knew rearranged itself around one impossible idea. The Duke had not come to this house as a stranger. He had come back. Elizabeth told no one what old Martha had said. Not the housekeeper, not the vicar's wife, and least of all the Duke himself. But she carried it with her everywhere, the way one carries a stone in one's pocket, reaching in to touch it 100 times a day. Mary Raven, turned out in the snow, with child. If it was true, if the Duke was that child, then he had bought this estate for a reason darker and sadder than money. And his words in the library took on a new and frightening weight. When you learn why I bought this house, you may not forgive me for it. What did he mean to do with it? Tear it down, burn the portraits, salt the earth where his mother had been humiliated. Elizabeth found she could not blame him for any of it, and that frightened her most of all because somewhere along the way she had stopped fearing this man and started aching for him. She watched him differently now at dinner. She saw things she had been blind to before. The way he always paused, just for half a heartbeat, in the doorway of the dining room before entering like a man steadying himself. The way he never once, in all these months, had let a servant carry anything heavy up the stairs without a word of thanks. The way his eyes followed the housemaid's work not with a master's scrutiny, but with something almost like tenderness, as if each one of them were someone he had known. or someone his mother had been. December arrived, and with it the first snow, and it was the snow in the end that broke the last of the ice between them. It happened on a Sunday. A tenant farmer's boy came pounding on the kitchen door at dusk. The old footbridge over the stream had collapsed under the weight of ice, and a shepherd was trapped on the far bank with a broken leg, the cold coming down like death itself. The Duke did not send men, he went. Elizabeth stood at the window and watched him ride out into the falling snow with the farmhands, and then, because she could not simply stand there, she took command of the house like a general. Fires built high in the kitchen, blankets warmed, hot broth, brandy, clean linen for splints. When the men returned 2 hours later, half frozen, carrying the shepherd on a hurdle, everything was ready. And it was Elizabeth's steady hands that helped the doctor set the leg, Elizabeth's calm voice that kept the man's weeping wife from fainting. It was past midnight when it was all over. The shepherd slept by the kitchen fire, his family around him. The house went quiet. And Elizabeth found the Duke standing alone in the great hall, still in his snow-wet coat, watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before. "You should change, Your Grace. You'll catch your death." "You did not have to do all this," he said. His voice was strange, rough. "The broth, the linens. You had every servant in this house moving like clockwork before I was half a mile down the road. It is what anyone would have done." "No," he took a step toward her. "It is not. I have known fine ladies all my life, Mrs. Ashford. I have watched them step over beggars in silk slippers. Not one of them would have spent her Sunday night on her knees on a kitchen floor holding a shepherd's hand. Another step. Who asterisk are you?" Elizabeth's heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "No one, Your Grace. Just a ruined widow keeping your house." "Do not," the words came out sharp, almost angry. "Do not call yourself that, not ever again, not in my hearing." They stood there in the cold hall, 2 feet apart, the candles guttering. His dark eyes searched her face, and Elizabeth realized she had stopped breathing. For one impossible moment she thought she knew he was going to close the distance between them. Instead, the Duke stepped back, bowed, and said in a voice that had gone quiet and careful again, "Good night, Elizabeth." Not Mrs. Ashford asterisk, not Madam asterisk. Elizabeth. She stood alone in the great hall long after his footsteps had faded, one hand pressed flat against her heart, terrified by the simple, enormous thing that was happening inside it. She was falling in love with the Duke of Ravenmore. God help her, the widow of the man whose family had destroyed his mother. The next weeks were the happiest Elizabeth had known in years, perhaps ever. Nothing improper passed between them, not a touch, not a word that the sternest chaperone could have condemned. And yet everything had changed. The dinner stretched longer. Elizabeth, he called her now, and she had begun, hesitantly, to answer to it. He showed her the plans he was drawing for the estate, new cottages for the tenants, a school for the village children, and asked for her thoughts, and argued with her happily when she gave them. "A school needs a proper stove, not a fireplace," she insisted, jabbing her finger at his drawing. "Have you ever tried to teach letters to a child whose fingers are too cold to hold a slate? Have you? I taught Sunday school for 6 years, Your Grace, while you were off buying banks. A stove." And the Duke of Ravenmore, the coldest man in England, the mystery no one in London could crack, threw back his head and asterisk laughed, and marked a stove on the plan. If only, Elizabeth thought, time could have stopped there, in the candlelight over the drawings, with his laughter still warming the room. But time never stops where we ask it to. It was the day before Christmas Eve, when Elizabeth walked to the village to bring Martha her Christmas basket. The lane was crowded with market day carts, and she had just passed the churchyard gate when a man stepped into her path. He was a stranger, city clothes, worn at the cuffs, a face she had never seen. He had been leaning against the wall as if waiting, and Elizabeth realized with a small chill that he had been waiting for asterisk her asterisk. Mrs. Ashford, he touched his hat. Mrs. Asterisk Charles Asterisk Ashford. I am she. Do I know you, sir? No, ma'am. The man glanced left and right, quick as a rat, and lowered his voice. But I've been paid to find you, paid to give you a message. A message from whom? The stranger leaned closer, and with the church bells ringing behind him and the snow beginning to fall, he said the words that stopped Elizabeth's world. From your husband, ma'am. Elizabeth stared at him. The market sound seemed suddenly very far away. My husband is dead, she said. He drowned at Dover more than a year ago. The man smiled, and it was not a kind smile. Did he now? He said softly. Well, he's a lively sort of ghost then, because he says to tell you this, ma'am, word for word. What was buried will rise before spring. Say nothing, do nothing. Wait. Who are you? Elizabeth's voice cracked. She grabbed at his sleeve, but he was already stepping back, tipping his hat, melting into the market day crowd. Who sent you? What does it mean, come back? But the man was gone. Elizabeth stood alone in the falling snow, Martha's basket dead weight on her arm, the church bells ringing and ringing above her. What was buried will rise before spring. Charles was alive. And in a house on the hill behind her, a man she loved was waiting for her at dinner, a man she could never, ever have. Because if Charles was alive, then she was not a widow at all. She was still his wife. Elizabeth did not go to dinner that evening. For the first time since the arrangement began, she sent word down that she was unwell, and it was barely a lie. She sat by her window in the dark, watching the snow fall, the stranger's words circling her mind like crows. What was buried will rise before spring. Say nothing, do nothing, wait. If Charles was alive, then everything was a lie. His death, her widowhood, her mourning, even her grief, which had been real, spent on a man who had not even done her the courtesy of truly dying. And if Charles was alive, then what was she? A wife whose husband had faked his death to escape his debts, a woman living under another man's roof, a woman who had let that other man call her Elizabeth in the candlelight and had lain awake afterward, warm with the sound of it. She should tell someone, the magistrate, the vicar, the duke. The duke. Elizabeth pressed her hands to her eyes. How could she tell him? What would she even say? Your Grace, the husband whose ruin brought me to your table may be alive after all, and everything growing between us must be cut down before it flowers. But perhaps it was a trick, a cruel joke, or some creditor's scheme to frighten her. Charles's coat had been found. The magistrate had been certain. A desperate man might send such a message to what? She could not even imagine what anyone would gain from it. Say nothing, do nothing, wait. In the end, that is what she did. God forgive her, that is what she did. She told herself she needed proof before she broke 2 lives with a stranger's whisper. She told herself it was prudence. It was fear. She knew it was fear. She simply could not bear to end the only happiness she had ever known, not yet, not on the word of a rat-faced man in a market lane. When she came down to dinner the following evening, pale and quiet, the Duke rose from his chair with real concern in his eyes. You are not well, he said. You should not have come down. I am quite recovered, Your Grace. We are back to Your Grace asterisk then, he said quietly, watching her face. What has happened, Elizabeth? For one trembling moment, she nearly told him everything. The words were on her tongue. But then she looked at him, at this granite man who had learned to laugh again at her dinner table, and she swallowed them down. Nothing, she said, nothing at all, I am only tired. It was the first lie she had ever told him. It would not be the last thing to come between them, because 3 days later the letter arrived. It came on the 2nd of January, slipped in among the household post, a cheap envelope, no seal, no sender, addressed in a careful, unfamiliar hand, Mrs. Ashford, private. Elizabeth opened it alone in her sitting room. Inside was a single sheet, and on it 5 lines. Nothing in that house is what it seems. The man you dine with each night is not your protector. Ask the Duke of Ravenmore why he truly bought the estate. Ask him what he means to do when spring comes. And ask yourself why a man pays a fortune for the home of a family he hates. A friend. Elizabeth read it 3 times, her hands growing colder with each reading. A family he hates. So someone else knew. Someone knew what old Martha knew, what Elizabeth herself had pieced together in the library that night. And this someone wanted her to be afraid. Her first instinct was to burn it. It was poison, plainly some enemy of the Duke's or some tormentor of hers stirring the pot. Whoever wrote it wanted to break something, and Elizabeth would not let them. But poison does its work, even when you know its name. Ask him what he means to do when spring comes. Because their asterisk was asterisk something. Elizabeth had noticed it herself these past weeks and had refused to look at it directly. The letters from London that made his jaw tighten. The solicitor who had visited twice since Christmas and left both times without dining. The way the Duke had said, when she showed him her plans for the spring garden, "Do not plan anything you would grieve to leave, Elizabeth." She had thought it a strange, sad joke. Now the words sat in her chest like ice. "What was buried will rise before spring," said her husband's messenger. "Ask him what he means to do when spring comes," said the letter. 2 warnings, 2 strangers, 1 season. What was coming in the spring? She held her silence for 4 days. On the 5th evening she broke. It was a quiet dinner, snow whispering against the windows. The Duke was telling her about the school, the builder had agreed to her stove, and there was to be a second one besides, and he was almost smiling, and it was all so warm and so good and so fragile that Elizabeth suddenly could not bear the weight of what she was carrying. "Why did you buy this house?" The words came out of her like a bird escaping through an open door. The Duke stopped mid-sentence. "I beg your pardon. This estate, this house." Her heart was pounding, but she had jumped now and there was no unjumping. "You could have bought any property in England, finer ones, grander ones. You knew this house before you ever bought it. You knew its curtains and its wells and its bread pudding. You stand in front of Lady Ashford's portrait at midnight with 30-year-old letters in your hand. Why this house asterisk, your grace? What do you want from it?" The warmth drained out of the room like water from a broken bowl. The Duke set down his knife and fork very precisely, and when he looked up at her, the granite mask was back, but behind it, for just a moment, she saw something flinch, something wounded. "Who has been speaking to you?" he said quietly. "Does it matter?" "It matters a great deal." "Then answer the question and it will not matter at all." Her voice rose despite herself. "I have lived under your roof for more than a year. I have kept your dinners and kept your house and kept your asterisk company, and I do not even know why I am here. You told me once that when I learned the truth I might never forgive you. What truth? What is coming in the spring, your grace? What do you mean to asterisk do?" The silence stretched so long that the candles seemed to burn lower in it. "There are things," the Duke said at last, and each word sounded as if it cost him blood, "that were set in motion long before I ever met you, Elizabeth. Things I swore on my mother's grave. I could not stop them now if I wished to." He paused. "And God help me, there are days I wish to." "That is not an answer." "It is the only one I have." "Then you may dine alone, your grace." Elizabeth stood, her chair scraping back, tears burning her eyes, angry tears, frightened tears. The Duke rose too, and for a moment she thought he would call her back, explain everything, make it all right. Instead he said, very quietly, "Elizabeth, whatever you may come to think of me, whatever you may hear, remember one thing. In this house no harm will ever come to you. That I swear." "The last man who made me a promise," Elizabeth said, "left his coat on a beach and let me weep over it." She saw the words land. She saw them cut. She walked out anyway and climbed the stairs blind with tears and locked her door for the first time in a year. Behind her, alone at the long table, the Duke of Ravenmore sat motionless in the candlelight, staring at the empty chair at his right hand. In the great silent house he had crossed 30 years and half a world to possess. And in her cold room, Elizabeth finally understood the cruelest thing of all. The letter had done exactly what it was written to do. For a week, the house was a house of strangers again. The dinners continued. Elizabeth would not break her word, whatever else was broken, but they were silent, formal, unbearable. The Duke was courteous. She was correct. Neither of them ate much. Twice she caught him watching her with an expression of such quiet misery that her anger nearly failed her. Twice she hardened her heart and looked away. It was the East Wing, in the end, that gave up the truth. The East Wing had been locked since the day the Duke arrived. The only part of the house Elizabeth was never given keys to. She had assumed it was simply closed off, dust-sheeted, forgotten. But on a gray January morning, she saw the housekeeper come out of its door carrying fresh flowers, fresh flowers in January from the hothouse, and lock it behind her. Fresh flowers carried into an empty wing. Every week, Elizabeth realized, she had seen it before without seeing it. That afternoon, the Duke rode to town to meet his solicitor, and Elizabeth did something she was not proud of. She took the housekeeper's keys from the pantry hook, walked to the East Wing, and let herself in. She found no dust sheets, no darkness. She found a shrine. The corridor was clean and warm, the lamps trimmed and ready, and the room at its end, a small, plain room, servant's room, tucked under the eaves with one narrow window, had been kept like a chapel. A narrow iron bed neatly made with a worn quilt folded at its foot, a washstand with a chipped blue basin, a servant's gray dress decades old hanging carefully behind the door, and on every surface, the windowsill, the small table, the shelf, fresh flowers. On the table lay a wooden box. Elizabeth's hands shook as she opened it, and she knew she had no right, and she opened it anyway. Inside were letters, dozens of them worn soft with reading, and on top, in a hand she now knew, she had seen it on estate papers 100 times, only younger here, more careful, a page that was not a letter at all, but something like a vow. I, Adam Raven, being 12 years of age, do solemnly swear before God, I will not always be poor. I will not always be nothing. One day I will buy the house that threw my mother into the snow, and I will tear it down stone by stone, until no wall remains of the place that broke her heart. This I swear on my life. Adam Raven. Elizabeth pressed her hand to her mouth. The Duke's Christian name was Adam. She had seen it once on a legal paper and thought nothing of it. She should have stopped there. She could not stop there. She unfolded the letter beneath, old, yellowed, the very letter she had seen in his hand that midnight in the library. It was addressed to Lady Ashford and dated 30 years past, and the hand was a woman's, uneven, exhausted, proud. My lady, I write not for myself but for my son, who is 3 years old and has done no wrong to anyone. Winter is come and I have no work, for no house will take a maid dismissed without a character. I do not ask to return. I ask only for a letter, one line in your hand, saying I served honestly, so that I may work and my boy may eat. You know the truth of why I was sent away, my lady. You know it was no fault of mine. I was a girl of 17 in your husband's house. I could not have refused him, and God knows I tried. One line, my lady, for the child's sake who has your husband's eyes. Your obedient servant, Mary Raven. At the bottom of the page, in a different hand, an elegant, cold, copperplate hand, someone had written 3 words. No reply, burn. But it had not been burned. Someone, a pitying secretary, a soft-hearted maid, God only knew, had kept it. And somehow, across 30 years, it had found its way back into the hands of Mary Raven's son. You knew, the Duke had whispered to the portrait. You knew, and you shut the door anyway. Elizabeth sank down onto the edge of the narrow servant's bed, the letter in her lap, and wept for a 17-year-old housemaid half a century dead, for a 3-year-old boy with his father's eyes and no bread, for the 12-year-old who had sworn an oath of ruin because rage was the only inheritance anyone had left him. She was still sitting there when the light changed in the doorway. The Duke stood in it, still in his riding coat, snow melting on his shoulders. His eyes went from her face to the open box to the letter in her lap, and Elizabeth saw the moment he understood that there was nothing left to hide. She expected fury. There was none left in him. He looked, suddenly, unbearably tired. "Her name was Mary," he said quietly. "You will not find her in the parish register here. She is buried in a pauper's grave outside Manchester with 11 strangers." He came into the room slowly and touched the worn quilt at the foot of the bed with 2 fingers, the way one touches a relic. This was her room. For years she slept here. She used to tell me about it, the window, the way the bells sounded on Sundays. She spoke of this house all her life, Elizabeth. The way other people speak of someone they loved who wronged them. "Adam," Elizabeth whispered. It was the first time she had ever said his name. He closed his eyes briefly, as if the word hurt. "She died when I was 14. Of nothing, really. Of being worn out." He straightened, and his voice went flat and factual, which was somehow worse than weeping. "I was clever, and I was angry, and it turns out those 2 things together can make a great deal of money. Trade, shipping, then the banks. The title came later. A distant cousin of my father's line died without heirs, and the crown found it convenient to give the dukedom to the richest claimant and ask no questions about his mother. Raven Moore." He smiled without any warmth at all. "I chose to keep her name inside it. It was the only monument I could give her that the world would be forced to say aloud, bowing. And this house. I have been buying the Ashford debts for 9 years." He said it simply, like a confession at last unburdened. Quietly, through other men's names. "Your husband was a fool and a gambler, Elizabeth, but fools sink faster when someone owns the water. I bought his notes. I raised no alarm and called in nothing. I only waited and let him ruin himself and made certain that when the house fell, no hand but mine could catch it." He looked at her then, steadily, taking no shelter. "You asked what is coming in the spring. The wreckers are coming, contracted 2 years ago. In April they will pull this house down to its cellars, stone by stone, and I meant to stand on the lawn and watch it fall and drink to her memory in the ruins. That was my answer to the letter in your lap. That was my whole life's answer." The room was very quiet. Snow ticked against the narrow window, the window Mary Raven had looked out of, 60 years ago, when the bells rang on Sundays. "And the dinners," Elizabeth said softly. "Tell me about the dinners, Adam." For a long moment he did not speak. When he did, his voice had lost all its granite, and what was left was just a man. "She had one dream. Not wealth, she never asked for wealth. She used to say to me, 'Adam, when I carried the dishes into that dining room, it was the most beautiful room I ever saw. Just once I should have liked to sit at that table, as a guest, as a person.'" His voice frayed. "She scrubbed floors until her hands bled, and her one dream in all the world was a asterisk chair asterisk, Elizabeth. So when I bought the house, before I tear it down, I swore she would have it. Every evening at 7, her son dines in that room like a gentleman at that table where she was never allowed to sit. Every dinner is hers, every single one." He looked at the floor. "I required you to join me because an empty table is not a dinner. It is a vigil. I could not bear a vigil every night. That was the whole of my price, that the room should have life in it. I did not plan." He stopped. "You did not plan for me," Elizabeth said. "No," the Duke said quietly. "I did not plan for you. I planned for revenge, and you have been quietly ruining it since the day I arrived. Every evening you sat in that chair and laughed. The house became less a thing to destroy. You have made it," his voice cracked, and he mastered it. "You have made it very difficult to hate, Elizabeth. And I do not know what I am if I stop hating." Elizabeth rose from the narrow bed. She crossed the little room, and she took the Duke of Ravenmore's hand, the first time she had ever touched him, and she felt him go still as stone. "I know exactly what you are," she said. "You are Mary Raven's son, and I think her dream came true 100-fold because her son does not merely asterisk sit at that table, he owns it and everything around it for 10 miles. Her eyes were streaming now, and she did not care. "But Adam, listen to me. If you tear this house down, her room comes down with it. The window, the Sunday bells, the dining room she dreamed of. The only place on this earth that remembers her is this one. Revenge will not give her a chair, my dear. It will only burn the room the chair stood in." The Duke stared at her, and Elizabeth watched 30 years of granite crack down the middle, watched his shoulders fall, watched him bow his head over her hand, and felt, warm on her fingers, the tears of a man who had not wept since he was 14 years old. They stood like that for a long time, in the small servant's room under the eaves, while the snow came down outside Mary Raven's window. Neither of them said the word love. Neither of them needed to. It stood in the room with them, quiet as the flowers, and both of them knew it was there. And both of them, God help them, had forgotten the world outside the window, where, in a shabby inn not 20 miles away, a man the sea had never taken was counting the last of his borrowed money, and reading, in a week-old newspaper, of the Duke of Ravenmore's residence at his former estate. Charles Ashford folded the newspaper and smiled. Spring asterisk, he thought, was coming early this year. For 3 weeks, the house on the hill was the happiest place in England. The wreckers were cancelled. The Duke wrote the letter himself at the long dining table and let Elizabeth read it before it was sealed, and when the solicitor wrote back in alarm, protesting about contracts and penalties, Adam replied with a single line that made Elizabeth laugh until she cried. "Pay them double, and tell them the house declined to die." Everything changed and nothing changed. The dinners went on at 7 o'clock, but now there was music in the house again, because Adam had Elizabeth's mother's piano tuned, and discovered she played beautifully, and took to standing by the fireplace listening with his eyes closed. Mary Raven's little room stayed as it was, warm and full of flowers, but its door was no longer locked. And one evening in early February, over the plans for the village school, Adam set down his pen and said, without preamble, "When your year of mourning is fully past, Elizabeth, and when this house is no longer between us like a debt, there is a question I mean to ask you. I will not ask it yet, but I am a man who plans ahead, and I thought it only honest to warn you." Elizabeth's heart turned over. "And how should I prepare for this question, Your Grace?" "You might practice," the Duke said gravely, returning to his pen, saying the word asterisk yes. She threw a bread roll at him. The Duke of Ravenmore, terror of the London banks, caught it out of the air and ate it, and the sound of their laughter carried all the way to the kitchens, where the cook told the housemaids, not for the first time, that there would be a wedding at the great house by summer. Mark her words. The whole household believed it. The whole village believed it. Even Elizabeth, who had learned the hard way not to trust happiness, had begun, carefully, secretly, to believe it. Then came the last evening of February. It had been a mild day, the first breath of fall spring, and the dinner had run long and warm. They were still at the table at 8:30, Adam sketching the schoolhouse roof on the back of a letter, Elizabeth insisting the chimney was in the wrong place, when they heard the carriage. Not a carriage, in truth. Something smaller and meaner, a hired gig, rattling up the long drive too fast in the dark. Then the bell rung hard. Then voices in the hall, the footman's rising, another cutting across it, and something in that second voice made Elizabeth's blood stop moving in her body before her mind even understood why. The dining room door swung open, and Charles Ashford walked in. He was thinner than she remembered and browner, as if he had lived somewhere with sun. His coat was good but not new, and his smile, that easy, charming smile she had once mistaken for a soul, was exactly, precisely the same. "Well," said the dead man, looking around the candle-lit room, "I see the old place hasn't changed. Hello, Lisbeth. You look astonishingly well for a widow." The room tilted. Elizabeth heard her own chair scrape as she stood, heard her own voice come out as a whisper. "You drowned. They found your coat. I mourned *you. You mourned a coat, my darling. A very good coat, too. I was sorry to lose it." Charles strolled into the room as if he owned it, drawing off his gloves finger by finger. "Water is a marvelous thing. It washes a man clean of his debts, his creditors, his mistakes. though I confess I did not expect it to wash my wife straight into the dining room of the richest man in England. His eyes slid to the Duke, bright with something hungry. "Your Grace, we have not been introduced. Charles Ashford of Ashford Hall, though I understand the deeds have moved about a bit while I was at sea." Adam had risen too. He said nothing at all. And Elizabeth, who knew his silences now the way sailors know weather, understood that the stillness in him was the stillness before something terrible. "You are supposed to be dead," she said. Her voice was shaking not with grief, with rage arriving at last a year and a half late. "The debts, Charles, the ruin. I stood in this hall while they carried out my mother's piano. I begged my own sister for a asterisk bed asterisk. Do you have any idea?" "The debts," Charles sighed, dropping into a chair uninvited and reaching for the wine. "Yes, about the debts, Lisbeth, since we are among friends, there is something you ought to know, and I fear it will sting." He poured himself a glass, taking his time, enjoying the audience. "There was money left. Rather a lot of it, actually. Your dowry, for a start. I never touched the principal, whatever the solicitors told you, and the 4,000 from your grandmother. I had it all moved abroad quietly the year before I left. The ruin asterisk, my dear, was a performance. One cannot vanish owing money, creditors are so dreadfully persistent about live debtors. But a asterisk dead asterisk man." He raised his glass in a small toast to himself. "A dead man's accounts close. A dead man's trail goes cold. It cost me a coat and a hat, and it bought me 18 months in Naples with a companion who found me considerably more agreeable than you ever did." Each sentence fell on Elizabeth like a separate stone. The poverty staged. Her humiliation staged. The friends who cut her, the sister who refused her, the nights she had wept for a drowned man, all of it asterisk, scenery in a play staged for creditors, with her grief as the leading performance and her ruin as the ticket price. "You let me starve," she whispered, "on purpose, as part of an asterisk plan asterisk. I let you asterisk inherit my tragedy asterisk, darling. There's a difference." Charles set down the glass, and the charm dropped away from his face all at once, like the coat off the rocks at Dover, and what was underneath was small and cold and precise. "But Naples is expensive, and companions more so, and here is the sad arithmetic. The money is gone. So I began thinking of home. And imagine my delight, Lisbeth, when the newspapers told me that my grieving widow was keeping asterisk house, they say, though the villages say something spicier, for his Grace the Duke of Ravenmore. A man worth, they tell me, 2 millions. He smiled again. And I thought to myself, Charles, you are not ruined at all. You own something that man wants. You have always owned it. You married asterisk it. Say what you came to say. It was the first time Adam had spoken. His voice was very quiet, and it made even Charles blink. "Gladly, your Grace. I'm a simple man. £10,000 and passage back to the continent, and I remain drowned forever. You may keep the house, the widow, the whole charming arrangement with my blessing." Charles spread his hands. "Refuse, and I resurrect, publicly. A living husband returned by Providence to find his wife installed under a rich man's roof. Every court in England gives me back my wife with a bow, and every newspaper in London eats her alive for breakfast. The Duke's kept woman caught by her own husband. You know what they will call her, your Grace. I need not say the word in company." He rose, collected his gloves, and paused at the door with the timing of a man who had rehearsed in the mirror. "You are a man of business. I'll return in 3 days for your answer. Oh, and Lisbeth." He looked at her, and for one moment she saw plainly, under all the charm and cruelty, how much he had always despised her. "Do stop looking at me as though I broke something. You cannot break what you own. The law of England says a wife's person, property, and company belong to her husband. I am simply deciding where to keep mine." The doors closed behind him. The gig rattled away down the dark drive. And in the candle-lit dining room, Mary Raven's dining room, the happiest room in England for 3 short weeks, Elizabeth Ashford stood amid the ruins of her second life, and understood the arithmetic of her existence with perfect, freezing clarity. She was not a widow, She had never been a widow. She was the lawful, living property of Charles Ashford, and no love, no duke, no fortune of 2 millions could change one line of the law that said so. Adam took a step toward her. "Elizabeth." "Don't," the word came out broken. She was backing away from him, one hand pressed to her mouth, because if he touched her now she would shatter entirely. "Don't you see what he's done? There is nothing to decide, Adam. If you pay him, he will come back. Men like Charles always come back. The money always runs out. And if you refuse him, he takes me. He can take me. It is the asterisk law asterisk." A sound came out of her that was half laugh, half sob. "You told me once that in this house no harm would ever come to me. You swore it. Oh, my dear, you should never make promises the law of England has already broken." She fled the room. He did not follow. He knew better than to follow. Instead, the Duke of Ravenmore stood alone at the long table for a very long time, beside her empty chair, in the room his mother had dreamed of. Then he picked up the bell and rang for his steward, and when the man came, breathless, he found his master perfectly calm, writing. "Wake the grooms. This letter goes to London tonight, to Mr. Garrick at Lincoln's Inn tonight, not tomorrow. Tell him I want everything that exists on Charles Ashford. Every ship's passage, every hotel, every gaming table, every asterisk companion." His pen paused, "from the day of his birth to the day of his drowning. Tell him to spend whatever it costs." "Yes, your grace, and shall I say what it concerns?" Adam Raven sealed the letter and looked up, and the steward would tell his wife afterward that he had never in his life seen anything so frightening as his grace's smile at that moment. "Tell him," said the Duke, "that a dead man has made me a proposal, and before I answer it I intend to learn precisely what else he buried." Elizabeth did not sleep that night. She sat by her window until dawn, and by the time the sky turned gray, she had made the coldest decision of her life. Because she had seen the truth, and the truth was a locked door with no key. If Adam paid the £10,000, Charles would drink it and gamble it and be back within 2 years, and then again, and again, forever. A blackmailer with a lawful claim never stops. Adam's fortune would bleed, his name would bleed, and the whispers would follow him to his grave. The Duke who bought another man's wife. And if Adam refused to pay, Charles would take her, yes. But first he would take Adam asterisk apart in every newspaper in England. The bastard son of a housemaid, risen too high, caught keeping a married woman. All of it dragged into the light. Mary Raven's name, the pauper's grave, the little room with the flowers, all of it turned into filth for strangers to laugh at over breakfast. Everything Adam had built as a monument to his mother would become the scandal of the decade. There was only one way to protect him. Charles had said it himself, without knowing he was handing her the weapon. You cannot break what you own. Charles owned her. Very well. Then she would go with what he owned, and she would take the scandal with her away from this house, away from Adam before it could destroy him. A wife returning to her living husband, however wretched, that was no scandal at all. That was merely the law working as the law worked. The newspapers would yawn. The Duke would be left untouched. A wealthy man who had charitably housed a widow, nothing more. But she knew Adam Raven now. She knew that if he suspected for one moment that she was sacrificing herself for him, he would burn his fortune, his name, and half of England to stop her. So he must not suspect. He must believe she chose it. He must believe she had never loved him at all. Elizabeth looked at her reflection in the gray dawn light, pale, hollow-eyed, 27 years old, and rehearsed the cruelest lie of her life until she could say it without weeping. Mary Raven gave up everything for her son, she thought. Let me be worthy of her room. Charles returned on the 3rd day, as promised, at noon, cheerful as a tax collector. He was shown into the morning room where Elizabeth waited alone. She had asked Adam by note to let her speak with her husband first, privately. Adam had agreed by note. They had not seen each other in 3 days. His notes were short and careful, like a man walking on ice. Her own were shorter. "Well, Lisbeth," Charles settled into a chair, "has his grace counted out my 10,000? There will be no 10,000. Elizabeth stood very straight by the window, her hands folded, her voice level. She had rehearsed. You are not going to blackmail the Duke, Charles, because there is nothing to blackmail him with asterisk. I am not his mistress. I never was. I am his housekeeper, and a housekeeper can give her notice. She turned to face him. You came for your property, take it. I will come with you. For once in his life, Charles Ashford was speechless. Whatever he had prepared for tears, defiance, a duke's fury, a fat check, it was not this. You will come with me, he repeated slowly. You are my husband, the law is the law. Every word tasted like iron. I ask only 2 conditions. We leave England, you cannot show your face here without your creditors finding it, and we both know it, so spare me the theater. And we leave asterisk quietly asterisk. Today. No newspapers, no scenes, no letters to his grace afterward. You wanted to disappear, Charles. Disappear with your wife and be grateful, because a scandal helps you even less than it helps him. Blackmail only works on a man with a secret, and after today, he won't have one. She watched him calculate, watched greed and suspicion fight it out behind his handsome eyes. £10,000 was £10,000, but 10,000 that might never be paid, from a duke whose lawyers frightened him more than he admitted, against a wife recovered free of charge, a wife whose sewing, whose respectability, whose asterisk usefulness could be spent abroad in 100 small ways. And here I thought you'd grown a spine, Lisbeth. He smiled and stood, brushing off his coat. Naples it is, then. Pack lightly. And do it before your duke changes his mind about letting his housekeeper go. I know what I'd do in his place, and it isn't asterisk nothing. His Grace, said Elizabeth, will not stop me, I will make certain of that. She found Adam in the library, standing by the tall window, and she knew, from the rigid line of his back, that a servant had already told him a trunk was being packed. It seems, he said without turning, that I am to lose my housekeeper. Yes, Your Grace. Your Grace. She saw it land between his shoulders like a blade. He turned, and his face was granite again, but his eyes were not. His eyes were a man drowning politely, and Elizabeth understood that the next 5 minutes would be the hardest work of her whole life. Elizabeth, his voice was low. There are things happening in London. My solicitor, I need days, a week, perhaps less. Whatever he holds over us, I promise you there is no asterisk us asterisk, Your Grace. The sentence stopped the room. She said it clearly, coldly, exactly as rehearsed, and watched it strike and hated herself and kept going, because half a lie is worse than none. I am grateful to you, please believe that. You gave me shelter when no one would, and I shall not forget it, but my husband is alive. Do you understand what those words mean to a woman like me? My marriage is alive. My place in the world is alive, restored to me by God's own mercy when I thought it drowned. What did I have here? A borrowed room in a house that used to be mine, and dinners with a man she made herself falter exactly there, made the pause say pity asterisk, made it say asterisk embarrassment, with a generous employer whose loneliness I was paid in bed and board to relieve. You are a good man, Your Grace, but you were never anything more to me than the roof. A woman does not love a roof. She is merely careful not to say so while it rains. Silence. The clock ticked. Adam Raven stood very still, the way a building stands still after the shell has hit and before it comes down, and when he finally spoke, his voice was almost a stranger's. You are lying. I am economizing. God, let her voice hold 3 sentences more. You are a duke, and I was a bankrupt's wife with 1 gray dress. Yes, I was pleasant at your table. Yes, I laughed at your remarks and admired your plans and let you call me by my Christian name. That is not love, Your Grace, that is rent asterisk. Every poor woman in England knows the difference. I am sorry you did not. She saw the last light go out of his eyes, and it was the worst thing she had ever seen, and she had watched her mother die. The carriage is waiting, she said. Charles and I leave within the hour. I ask you, as your housekeeper's final request, not to follow, not to write, and not to asterisk interfere asterisk. You once made me a promise in this house. Keep this one instead. She turned at the door. He had not moved. He was staring at the empty air where she had stood, like a man reading a ledger that refused to balance. And because she was human and breaking and could not help herself, Elizabeth committed her single, tiny act of treason against her own plan. "Your Grace, one last thing, a housekeeping matter." Her voice was steady, only her hands, hidden in her skirts, were shaking. "The dining room, after I am gone, do not let the table sit empty at 7 o'clock. Invite the vicar, the steward, anyone. An empty table is not a dinner, it is a vigil." She swallowed. And she did not scrub floors for 20 years so that her son could keep vigils. She did it so that he could *live. Tell her that tonight when you sit down. Tell her it was the finest room I ever saw. And Elizabeth Ashford walked out of the library, down the great staircase, past the silent weeping servants, and into her husband's hired carriage, spine straight, eyes dry, heart in ruins behind her on the floor of the house she loved. Charles settled back against the cushions as the horses started, looking her over with proprietary amusement. "Cheer up, Lisbeth. Naples is lovely in the spring. You'll keep the rooms, manage the money I give you, and smile at the card tables. I find English wives make everything look respectable. And who knows," he yawned, "if you're very useful, I may even be kind." Elizabeth looked out the window, at the house on the hill growing smaller, at the tall library window, where a motionless figure stood watching the carriage all the way down the drive, until the trees took it. "It is done," she thought. "He is safe. It is done." But in the library, the Duke of Ravenmore was not mourning. He was standing at the window, repeating her farewell to himself, word by word, like a banker finding the error in the ledger at last. An empty table is not a vigil. She did not scrub floors so her son could keep vigils. Words he had said once, in a small room under the eaves, to one living soul on this earth. Words a woman does not carry out the door, does not weep into her last goodbye, does not spend her final breath in a house on, if that house is only a roof. "You are lying," Adam Raven said softly to the empty drive. "You magnificent, ruinous woman, you are lying to save me." He crossed the library in 4 strides and rang the bell hard enough to crack the pull. "Your Grace," the steward appeared at a run. "My fastest horse, and send word ahead to Lincoln's Inn. I ride to London within the hour." The Duke was already pulling on his gloves, and his eyes had a light in them that had been missing for 3 days, that had, in truth, been missing for 30 years. "Mr. Garrick has had 4 days to dig up a dead man's grave. Let us go and see what he found in it." Mr. Garrick of Lincoln's Inn had served the Duke of Ravenmore for 11 years, and in that time he had learned 2 things. His Grace paid better than any client in London, and his Grace never, ever burst into a room. So when the doors of his chambers flew open at 9 o'clock that evening, the Duke still in his riding clothes, mud to the knee, having changed horses twice on the London road, Mr. Garrick understood at once that the world had shifted. "Tell me you have something," the Duke said, without greeting. 4 days, Garrick. Tell me a man cannot live 34 years and fake his own death without leaving one loose thread. Garrick was already moving to his desk. "Your Grace, I was drafting a letter to you this very hour. I have found several threads. One of them," the old solicitor paused, choosing his words with lawyerly care, "one of them, if it holds, is not a thread at all. It is a rope, and it fits a hangman's purpose admirably." "Show me." Garrick laid the papers out one by one, in the order his men had unearthed them, and told the story as he went. Began with the drowning as instructed, simple work. The boatman at Dover who rowed a gentleman out to a French fishing vessel the very night the coat was found, he remembers it well because he was paid triple and told to forget it. He assigned a statement. He forgets nothing now. 1 paper. The fishing vessel landed at Calais. From Calais, a man traveling as Mr. Charles Aston, a thin disguise, Your Grace. Vain men cannot bear to lose their initials, took the coach south. Hotels in Paris. Then Nice. Then Naples. 3 more papers. In Naples he lived 18 months at the Palazzo Ferrandino with a woman he presented as his wife. Gambling debts there too in the end. It appears the sea washes a man's habits less thoroughly than his name. All useful, Adam said tightly. All damning, but fraud and false death he would flee such charges, Garrick, and take her with him beyond our reach before any warrant crossed the channel. You spoke of a rope. I did. Garrick drew out the final document and he held it a moment, the way a man holds something explosive. Your Grace, my men in Naples asked a routine question. When a gentleman installs a lady in a palazzo and calls her his wife, one asks, does he call her that in asterisk law? Neapolitan clerks keep excellent records and they are poorly paid, which is a happy combination for our purposes. There was no Naples marriage. But the lady herself, an Englishwoman, Your Grace, a Mrs. Foster, spoke freely once she understood Mr. Aston's money was gone and ours was arriving. She was bitter. Abandoned women often are. The old man's eyes glittered. She told my agent that Charles had jilted her once before, years ago, that he had, in her words, done his vanishing trick on her the first time in Ostend, a fortnight after the wedding. The room went very still. The wedding, the Duke repeated. The wedding, Your Grace. Ostend, in Belgium. 11 years ago, 3 years before he stood in an English church with Miss Elizabeth Weston. Garrick laid the paper down and turned it to face the Duke. My agent took the packet boat to Ostend himself. This is a certified copy of the register of the Anglican chaplaincy there. I received it by courier this afternoon. Adam Raven looked down at the document, at the neat clerical hand, the date, the witnesses, and the two names joined on a single line. Charles Edward Ashford, Bachelor, of Kent, England. Sarah Jane Foster, spinster, of Margate, England. Married this 9th day of June, in the presence of God and the undersigned witnesses. He married her, Adam said slowly. He legally married this woman and abandoned her and never divorced her. There is no divorce, Your Grace. We have searched. There is no annulment. And most importantly of all, Garrick permitted himself, for the first time in 11 years, a smile in front of a client. There is no death asterisk. Sarah Foster is alive. She is, as of 3 weeks ago, residing in Naples in reduced circumstances and very, very willing to travel. My agent has already engaged her passage. She is likely at sea as we speak. The Duke gripped the edge of the desk. He needed to hear it said plainly, needed the words out loud in the room. Then say it, Garrick, say what it means. It means, Your Grace, that Charles Ashford was a married man 3 years before he ever met your Elizabeth. The old solicitor spoke each sentence like a bell tolling. It means his second marriage was void from the moment it was spoken, not ended, not broken, void as though it had never occurred. It means the crime of bigamy, which is a felony punishable by transportation. Add to it the false registration of his own death and the fraud upon his creditors, and the man is done. But Your Grace, hear the heart of it. Garrick leaned forward. It means that the lady was never his wife, not for 1 hour, not for 1 minute. Whatever the law gave that man over her, her person, her property, her obedience, the law now takes back entirely from the beginning of time. She was never Mrs. Ashford. She has been these 8 years Miss Elizabeth Weston, a free woman, wronged by a criminal. A free woman. Adam Raven sat down, simply sat, for the first time in 4 days in the chair before the fire, and put his head in his hands and began, very quietly, to laugh. It was a sound Mr. Garrick had never heard from him and would never hear again. Relief and fury and love and exhaustion, all breaking out of a man at once. 8 years, he said at last, raising his head. 8 years that blackguard held her with a paper that was worth nothing. She wept for him, Garrick. She starved for his debts. And this very morning she got into his carriage and gave up her whole life because she believed the law was his. He stood, and the laughter was gone, and what replaced it made Garrick take an involuntary step back. Where are they now? He spoke of the continent. If he gets her onto a ship. Anticipated, Your Grace. Garrick was already pulling the map. A man who plays dead does not sail from Dover, where boatmen know his face. My men have watched the ports since yesterday. This evening came word. A Mr. and Mrs. Aston have taken rooms at the Anchor Inn at Harwich and passage on the Marguerite bound for Hamburg. He looked up. She sails on the morning tide day after tomorrow. Then we have 1 day. 1 day, your grace, and 1 difficulty. A warrant needs a magistrate, the documents need certifying, and Sarah Foster's ship from Naples cannot arrive in time. If Ashford grows nervous and boards early, or bribes the captain to slip out on the evening tide instead, then we shall have to make certain, said the Duke of Ravenmore, taking up his gloves, that he has no reason to be nervous. Send to Harwich tonight, Garrick, not constables, a letter, addressed to Mr. Charles Aston from my own hand. And as he spoke, the fury in his face resolved into something colder and finer, the look of a man who had spent 30 years learning how the powerful destroy the innocent, and was about to spend it all, every scar of it, in the opposite direction. Tell him the Duke of Ravenmore has reconsidered his proposal. Tell him £10,000 awaits him in exchange for a signed deed of separation, so that the lady may live undisturbed. Tell him I will bring the money to Harwich myself, the day after tomorrow, at noon. He smiled, and it was his mother's smile, though he did not know it. Greed has kept that man in England 4 days longer than sense allowed. Let greed hold him 1 day more. And if he suspects a trap, he will suspect everything except the truth, because the truth requires knowing that he was ever legally married, and vain men, Garrick, remember their triumphs and bury their inconveniences. He buried Sarah Foster in Ostend 11 years ago. Adam pulled on his gloves and turned to the door. He is about to learn what my family knows better than any in England, that the buried do not always stay buried. Sometimes they come back on the morning tide. At that hour, 90 miles away, in a narrow room at the Anchor Inn at Harwich, Elizabeth sat by a cold window, listening to the harbour bells and the sound of Charles losing money at cards in the taproom below. She did not weep. She had promised herself in the carriage that she was done with weeping, that she would be like Mary Raven now, who had endured worse than this and still taught her son that laughter was a victory. 2 days more and the sea would close over her old life. She would endure. Women endured. It was the one country where they had always been citizens. But when the taproom finally fell silent, long past midnight, and she was sure no living soul could hear, Elizabeth allowed herself a single, whispered treason, breathed against the cold glass toward the west, toward a hill and a house and a table set for 7 o'clock. Tell her it was the finest room I ever saw. She did not know, how could she know, that at that very moment on the black London road, a rider was changing horses at Chelmsford with the King's own urgency, that in a Naples harbor, a bitter woman with a marriage line in her trunk was watching England rise over the horizon of her future, and that the trap her tormentor had spent 2 years building out of coats and tides and dead men's names was about to close. On him, the morning tide was coming, and it was bringing the Duke. The morning of the Marguerite's sailing dawned bright and cold, with a good wind for Hamburg, and Charles Ashford woke in the best temper of his life. The letter had arrived the evening before by liveried messenger, and he had read it 4 times over his wine, laughing louder with each reading. The Duke of Ravenmore has reconsidered. Of course he had. They always reconsidered. The proud one's pride was merely a price, like everything else. £10,000 delivered to Harwich at noon by His Grace personally, in exchange for a signed deed of separation. Charles would have the money at noon, and be on the evening tide with it, and keep the wife anyway. For what court would enforce a deed against a husband once he was beyond the sea? He would have the Duke's gold and the Duke's woman, and there was nothing on this green earth the great Ravenmore could do about it. Wear the blue dress, he told Elizabeth over breakfast, expansive with victory. Your Duke is coming to buy your freedom. The least you can do is look worth the price. Elizabeth set down her cup with a hand that did not tremble, though everything inside her was trembling. Adam is coming. Why is Adam coming? She had built her whole sacrifice on him staying away. She had made him promise. And now he was riding into Charles's reach with £10,000, buying a paper Charles would never honor, and she would have to stand there and watch the man she loved be robbed a second time on her account. "You said no letters," she said quietly. "No interference. That was our agreement, Charles." That was before he offered me £10,000 to interfere. Charles buttered his toast, delighted with himself. "Do try to look tragic at the handover, Lisbeth. Men pay more promptly when the goods look tragic." At 11:30, they walked down to the harbor. The quay at Harwich was crowded. Sailors, porters, fishwives, passengers for the Marguerite *, half the town going about its salt-smelling business under the bright cold sky. Charles had chosen the meeting place himself, publicly, cleverly. The open quay before the custom house, where no violence could be offered and no trick attempted, with his ship swinging at anchor not 300 yards off. He positioned Elizabeth beside him like a stage property, and consulted his watch with the air of a man collecting a debt. At noon precisely, the crowd stirred and parted. The Duke of Ravenmore came down the quay, and Charles's first flicker of unease was that he did not come alone. At his shoulder walked a dry old gentleman in black with a leather case. Behind them, 2 constables of the town, and behind them, drawn by the scent of great folk as gulls are drawn to a ketch, half the crowd of the harbor came drifting along the quay to watch. "Your Grace," Charles swept off his hat, all charm, pitching his voice for the audience. "A pleasure. Though I confess the constables seem excessive, we are only 2 gentlemen signing a paper." "The constables are not excessive," said the Duke. "They are punctual." His voice carried. He had meant it to carry. Something in it made the nearest onlookers go quiet, and the quiet spread outward across the quay like a ring in water. "Mr. Garrick." The Duke did not take his eyes from Charles. "The gentleman is expecting a document. Give him his document." The old solicitor opened the leather case and produced a single paper. Charles took it, still smiling, and Elizabeth, watching his face, saw the exact moment the smile died. She had known that face 8 years. She had seen it charming, lying, gloating, cruel. She had never once seen it afraid. "What?" Charles's voice dropped to a hiss. "What is this supposed to be?" "A certified copy of a marriage register," said Mr. Garrick pleasantly, and his voice was pitched for the crowd too. The old man had spent 40 years performing for juries. "The Anglican chaplaincy at Ostend. The 9th of June, 11 years past, recording the lawful marriage of Charles Edward Ashford, bachelor, of Kent." Each word rang across the silent quay like a coin dropped on stone. "To Sarah Jane Foster, spinster, of Margate." The crowd's murmur rose like a wave. Elizabeth heard the words, heard them plainly, and could not make them mean anything. 11 years. 3 years before the church in Kent. 3 years before. A forgery. Charles's face had gone the color of tallow. He tore the paper in half and the crowd gasped, and Mr. Garrick smiled the smile of a man with a case full of copies. "A trick, Your Grace. This is beneath you, that marriage, that woman is dead." "Is she?" said the Duke of Ravenmore. And he turned and looked down the quay, and the crowd turned with him. A woman was walking toward them through the parted onlookers. A tall woman, no longer young, in a worn traveling cloak, with a face that had once been handsome and was now merely hard as Naples winters, hard as broken promises, hard as 11 years of abandonment. She walked steadily, looking at no one in the crowd, looking at one man only, and the sea wind blew her hood back, and Charles Ashford made a sound that Elizabeth would remember to the end of her days. A small, strangled, drowning sound, the sound of a man watching his own coat wash up on the rocks. "Hello, Charles," said Sarah Foster. Her ship had made port on the morning tide. "You look astonishingly well for a bachelor." What followed, the town of Harwich would retell for 30 years. Charles ran. Of course he ran, bolted like a rat along the quay toward the ship's boats, shoving past a fish seller, and got 11 yards before a porter's handcart, quite accidentally on purpose, swung across his path, and the 2 constables had him by the arms. He did not go quietly. He went shrieking about forgeries, about conspiracies, about his rights, about being a gentleman, and the crowd of Harwich, which had watched him preen on their key all week as Mr. Aston laughed at him. That was the part he could never afterward bear, they said, not the arrest, the laughter. Charles Edward Ashford. The magistrate's clerk read from the warrant while the constables held him. You are taken on the charges of bigamy, of felony, of fraudulently procuring the registration of your own death, and of fraud upon your creditors. You will come with us. Elizabeth, Charles twisted in their grip and found her face in the crowd, and even now, the charm came crawling back into his voice, wheedling, intimate, sure of its old power. Lisbeth, tell them you are my wife. A wife cannot tell them what we are to each other. And Elizabeth Weston, who had starved for this man, mourned this man, and climbed into a carriage to be owned by this man forever, stepped forward on the quay, and answered him at last, in a voice that carried to every listening soul in Harwich. We are nothing to each other, sir. We never were. It seems you made certain of that in Ostend, 3 years before you ever knelt to me in a church and lied to God's face. Her voice did not break. It rose. You took my dowry, my name, my youth, and 8 years of my life, and every hour of it was theft, because none of it was ever yours to take. I mourned your coat, Charles. I will not mourn you. The crowd of Harwich roared. They took him away along the quay, past the staring sailors and the laughing fishwives, and the last Elizabeth ever saw of Charles Ashford was his fine coat disappearing between 2 constables into the custom house. A small man, at the end, going into a small door. And then the crowd and the noise, and the whole bright cold world seemed to fall away, because the Duke of Ravenmore was standing in front of her. You came, she whispered. I made you promise not to come. You made me promise not to interfere. His voice was unsteady. His granite was gone, all of it forever, she thought, and his eyes were the eyes of the man in the little room under the eaves. I have interfered with Mr. Garrick, with the Belgian church records, with the Naples packet service, with a boatman at Dover, and with the entire criminal law of England. But you may note, madam, that I never once interfered with you. You freed yourself just now on this quay in front of the whole town. I only carried the paper. Adam, she was laughing and weeping at once, and half of Harwich was watching, and she could not have cared if all of England watched. The things I said to you in the library, the rent the roof, Adam, I swear before God, not one word of it. I know. He took her hands, both of them, in front of everyone. I knew before your carriage reached the gates. You quoted my mother to me, Elizabeth. A woman does not spend her last goodbye on another woman's dream, not unless she loves the dreamer. He drew a breath, and Elizabeth realized, astonished, that the Duke of Ravenmore, terror of the London banks, owner of half a county, was nervous. I told you once there was a question I meant to ask when nothing stood between us. Nothing stands between us now. You are not a widow. You were never a wife. You are Miss Elizabeth Weston, a free woman on a public quay, and I find I cannot wait for a better room. And before the custom house, before the sailors and the porters and the fishwives, before Mr. Garrick, who studied the horizon with great professional interest, and Sarah Foster, who watched with grim, wrecked satisfaction, and later said it was the only good thing Charles Ashford ever caused in his life. The Duke of Ravenmore went down on one knee on the wet stones of Harwich Quay. Miss Weston, my mother carried dishes into a dining room she was never allowed to sit in, and her son swore to tear that room down until a ruined woman with one gray dress sat down at its table and taught him what it was for asterisk. His voice carried, and he let it carry, let all the world hear. Marry me, not as shelter, not as rescue, not as rent. He smiled up at her, and it was his mother's smile. Sit at my table, Elizabeth, every evening at 7 o'clock, as long as we both shall live. That is my price. It has only ever been my price. The gulls wheeled, the tide turned, half of Harwich held its breath. Yes, said Elizabeth, and she had practiced the word, just as he had once commanded. But in the end it came out through tears, and she had to say it twice, and the second time the whole key heard it because the whole key cheered. 1 year later, the great hall of the house on the hill had seen many things in its long life. It had seen a piano carried out through its doors and carried back in. It had seen a ruined woman stand alone among strangers, and a duke arrive with one condition. But on this warm May evening, 1 year later, it saw something it had never seen before. It saw a christening party. The house blazed with light from cellar to attic. The gardens were strung with lanterns. Half the village had come, the tenant farmers and their wives, the shepherd whose leg had mended straight, old Martha from the mill cottage in her Sunday best, the schoolchildren from the new school with its 2 stoves, scrubbed and shy and eating cake with both hands. The Duke of Ravenmore had thrown open his doors to every soul in the parish, and every soul in the parish had come. Because 6 weeks earlier, the Duchess of Ravenmore had given her husband a son. They had named him, to the surprise of absolutely no one, Adam. But it was his second name that had made the vicar's voice catch during the christening that morning, and made old Martha weep openly in the front pew. Adam Raven Weston, Marquis of Harwich. Raven carried forward now not as a wound, but as an inheritance. At 7 o'clock, as the party glowed on in the gardens, the family withdrew, as they did every evening, wherever they were, whatever the occasion, to the dining room. The room had changed only in one particular. The Ashford portraits had been moved, respectfully, to the gallery upstairs. Elizabeth herself had insisted they not be destroyed, and Adam had learned long ago not to argue with his wife about mercy. In their place, above the great stone fireplace in the position of highest honor, hung a single new portrait. It showed a young woman in a plain gray dress, seated in the kitchen garden with the house rising behind her. The painter had worked from Adam's memory in one faded miniature, and he had worked well. The woman's hands were work-roughened and folded in her lap, and her smile was quiet and warm and looked, everyone said, remarkably like the Duke's. On the rare and treasured occasions the Duke smiled. The small brass plate beneath read simply, "Mary Raven, of this house." Elizabeth sat at her husband's right hand, their son asleep in the crook of her arm, and watched Adam pour the wine. He glanced up at the portrait as he did it. He always did. One small look, every evening, and Elizabeth, as she always did, pretended not to notice, and loved him for it beyond the reach of words. "A letter came today," she said, "from Margaret." Adam's hand paused on the decanter. Elizabeth's sister had written twice since the wedding, cautious, mortified letters, thick with self-justification, and Elizabeth had answered both kindly and promised nothing. "She asks," Elizabeth went on, "whether she and Henry might call next month. She writes that she has been." She consulted the letter with a raised eyebrow, much occupied with reflection. "Reflection," said the Duke, in the tone of a man weighing the word for hanging offenses. "She left you to the hedgerows, Elizabeth. If a tenant of mine turned a dog out in that winter, I'd have." "I know what she did." Elizabeth said it without heat. She looked down at her sleeping son, at his impossibly small fist curled against her breast. "And I have been much occupied with reflection too. Here is mine. I was saved, Adam. When every door in England shut, one opened. If I now shut mine, what did I learn from any of it?" She smiled at him. "Besides, I want our son to have family. Complicated family is still family. Someone once taught me that hating a house, or a sister, only burns the rooms you might have lived in. That is not quite what you said. I have improved it. Wives do that." And the Duke of Ravenmore, terror of the London banks, laughed out loud the laugh that was no longer rare, and surrendered, as he always surrendered, to her, and only to her. "Write to her, then. Tell her to come. Tell her," he paused, and the old granite flickered once, only once, in his eyes, "tell her to come at 7 o'clock. There is always a place at this table for anyone who arrives asking, Elizabeth. My quarrel was only ever with the ones who were asked and refused." Above the fireplace, Mary Raven smiled down at her son. Later, much later, when the lanterns in the garden had burned low and the village had sung its way home down the hill, Elizabeth stood at the tall window of the dining room with her son in her arms, looking out at the dark rolling land, all of it theirs, all of it at peace. She thought, as she rarely allowed herself to think now, of the woman who had stood in this house 2 years ago, the woman with one gray dress and one packed trunk, watching strangers carry her life out the front door, with nowhere on this earth to go. That woman had believed her story was over. She had believed the whole sum of her life could be counted on that gravel drive, and that the total was nothing. And then a carriage had come up the drive, with one condition inside it. Adam came to stand behind her and wrapped his arms around them both. His wife, his son, his mother's dining room, his whole unbroken world, and Elizabeth leaned back against him and watched the last lantern go out in the garden. Once a man had lost everything this family had and fled. But standing in the quiet candlelight, with her son's heartbeat against her own, the Duchess of Ravenmore knew the truth that all of Harwich had cheered on a cold, bright key, the truth that a housemaid's son had crossed 30 years to prove. Everything her first husband had lost was nothing. Nothing beside everything she had found. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.